Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Web3 Native Podcast. I know this year has been a little bit slow, and so we're on the second episode of the year, but it's one that I really look forward to speaking about. Please welcome Spaydh, who is core contributor at Neutron.
Hey, Shikai. Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me.
All right. There's a lot that we want to dive into, and I know we'll get into all the details about Neutron, but to give it like a little bit of color, the one thing that the audience should know about is that it is a core part of the Cosmos ecosystem. And so before kind of introducing Neutron, I just wanted to kick off with a tweet that has really stuck in my mind for the last few months, right? And I think leading up to this episode, that we've had a few episodes in the past about Cosmos with Zaki about history, and then with Ethan. In fact, I think we spoke like right after Prop 82 was rejected, so that was a critical moment. And today we are here with a live replicated security chain. But then we have a tweet from Zaki recently, and it says, I think Cosmos social capital has about 12 months to do something unique and differentiated. Otherwise, we get swallowed by ETH-flavored variants of Cosmos-originated ideas like Rolabs and Eigenlayer. I feel intense urgency. The hour is late. Spaydh, what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, it's definitely a very interesting tweet. So much so that, in fact, Zaki's tweet and also our discussions with you, Shikai, kind of inspired us to have a dedicated panel about the topic at Gateway. I think, roughly speaking, my take on the matter is that I agree with the sense of urgency. Being immobile is not really an option. But I also do think that, first, Cosmos has very strong social capital. It has strong thesis that it can play on, and it has fairly solid tech, basically. Now, what I think we've lacked, basically, is serious teams that are able to take this tech and turn them into products that people actually want to use, so that it's not just theoretical valuable tech. It's actually powering some of these functions and demonstrating sort of the ability of all of this infrastructure, the Cosmos SDK, Cosmosm, IBC, and all of the others, right? And that's in fact one of the things that we're trying to do at Neutron, right? Like, Neutron is taking a lot of these technologies, putting them together in a way that helps bring them to market, basically. And what makes me fairly optimistic is that I think this realization now sort of permeates Cosmos, and there's a lot of teams that are moving in that direction now. DYDX moving to Cosmos is obviously like a strong plus in this regard. Noble is also doing active work on this, and you have folks like Polymer who are trying to build around IBC sort of like organizational capacity to really take these things and push them to the next level, get teams to work on them, get more efficient coordination, and start like connecting to the rest of Web3, so that these products can finally sort of like take their place in the market. So I think I agree with the sense of urgency. Like, we do need to do our absolute best to not only continue developing these technologies, but also bring them to market in meaningful ways. But actually, I'm pretty optimistic about our ability to do so over the next year.
Yes, and in fact, the urgency or the lateness, when Zaki refers to that hour is late, might help to motivate the teams, right? And we can see already so much progress, like you said, being made with validating the app chain thesis from DYDX, asset issuance like Noble, Polymer working on IBC, and of course, Neutron as a core piece to validate replicated security, which is arguably probably the key product of Cosmos Hub today, or I view it as like the key innovation of the Cosmos Hub. And well, for those who are not fully familiar, Neutron is the first partner chain, or some call that consumer chain, of the Cosmos Hub, and it's the first live example of replicated security being offered by the Cosmos Hub. It also marks the beginning of the creation of what we call the Atom Economic Zone. And to differentiate itself with other chains, Neutron is able to provide all sorts of cross-chain technologies, so not just vanilla IBC, but also things like ICA, ICQ. Now, I just spotted a whole bunch of like terms and acronyms. All right, we talk like partner chain, consumer chain, replicated security, interchain security, IBC, IC, ICQ. There's just so many terms, and sometimes I feel that like why does Cosmos have to make it so complicated? uh, but it's also fun. And so it would be helpful actually to our viewers if we can just walk through some of these terms, starting with maybe like partner consumer chain, a replicated interchain, or shared security, and like how are these terms like come up? Are there differences within these terms when we refer to them?
Yeah, for sure. So starting with interchain security, replicated security, basically those two terms refer to um, the idea that you can use one blockchain's proof of stake engine to secure another blockchain, right? So um, in the case of replicated security, the specific flavor of interchain or cross-chain security that's live today on the Cosmos Hub, the rough idea is that you can use the stake and validator set of a provider chain, in this case, the Cosmos Hub, the largest, best capitalized chain in the Cosmos ecosystem, and you can essentially lend it to another blockchain by sending messages to that blockchain to tell it, hey, those are your validators and their voting power, and those are the ones who should be producing, like, validating your blocks. And in exchange for that, the consumer chain, which receives the economic security and the validator set from the provider chain, so here in this case that would be Neutron, essentially benefits from a range of perks that we can cover later. But in exchange for this service, this consumer chain either shares revenue, provides tokens, or other forms of compensations to the hub, right? Currently, this is mostly handled via like governance negotiations, whereby the Cosmos Hub needs to approve a project to launch on replicated security, and that security agreement, the compensation model, is sort of like a core piece of that agreement. To simplify, you have the consumer or partner chain, in this case Neutron, which receives validator stake and stake, and pays out 25% of its revenue to the Cosmos Hub, right? And so you have sort of like this mutually beneficial relationship where the more successful the consumer chain is, the more revenue it generates for the Cosmos Hub, which helps increase the value of Atom as an asset, and therefore the capitalization of the Cosmos Hub and its security, which then makes the consumer chain more secure. And so you have this sort of like loop here.
For sure, and we will definitely go into more details there in a little bit. Actually, just curious whether why did the name evolve from like consumer chain to partner chain? Was there a particular nuance or implication there?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things. The first one is, I think there's a tension within, replicated security is a very new technology. It's like the first time that it's in production with Neutron coming live. And so some of that taxonomy is still sort of like being refined. Initially, the idea of, provider chain and consumer chain refers like to sort of like a service agreement conception of the exchange of security in exchange for revenue. And so it's somewhat specific in this regard, which is a good perk. But it has two downsides, which is that one, it sort of like creates this very hierarchical relationship between the two projects, and two, it also contains, like, it is framed as sort of a service agreement, which may be problematic in that in replicated security, there's an upfront cost to the validator set of the Cosmos Hub, which has to run additional nodes for the new blockchain that is being launched. But the revenue, every project take time before they actually reach product market fit and maturity and start generating meaningful amounts of revenue. And so you have sort of a mismatch between the moment at which the cost starts being paid and the moment at which revenue starts being generated. And so that mismatch is more akin to a relationship that you would have in a sort of investment, e.g. the Cosmos Hub and its community pool is investing in a project that it thinks will be successful in its own terms in the future, generate revenue and share a portion of that with the hub, but also in other ways will provide value to the sort of like sub ecosystem, the network of consumer chains that will exist around the hub, right? So the Atom economic zone, right?
Right.
So
So
that would be for the consumer chain term, like consumer provider. Now, there's a new term that has surfaced, pushed by folks at the Atom Accelerator DAO and others, which is like partner chains. I think what is great about this term is that it really shows sort of like the synergistic nature of chains within the Atom Economic Zone. Like that's the main um, requirement for that entire sort of like endeavor to be successful, right? You need to have you need to leverage the close proximity and trust assumptions of these blockchains in order to generate additional value for the whole endeavor to be as successful as it may be. But it does have one problem, which is that it applies to both chains, and so it's pretty hard to know which chain you're talking about. Like, which partner chain is it? Neutron, the Cosmos Hub, or so? Yeah, I think we probably need to continue thinking about the taxonomy to get it perfectly right. But yeah,
I see. So was this so it has somewhat political kind of objectives to neutralize that positioning so that it's not like we're providing a service and rather like, hey, we're partners trying to figure it out and we are in this position and where we want upside and you're in this position where we want security and connections and therefore it's a partnership rather than like I'm providing a service for you.
correct. Yeah.
Right. So it also sounds that like, so if I'm providing a service, kind of if I'm the hub and like doing business as an infrastructure provider, then it's kind of I want to attract as many as possible. But then the connotation of a partnership also means that I kind of want to curate who I want to be part of this group, right? This coalition of this like atom economic zone as well. So what does it mean for developers or app chains, right? Like what kind of app chains or ideas would be suitable? And I know this would be a question that would be much better addressed with, like, say, a DAO. But perhaps through your interactions with the hub and the DAO and the members of the community, you might have some ideas as well. And we do know there are quite a few coming up.
Yeah, for sure. I think like once again, like here there's also a tension which takes its roots from some of like the technical implementation and the economic model of the technology currently. There is this eventual goal of having replicated security function on a permissionless basis, or at least a much more streamlined sort of like system. In which case, you would have um, a much easier onboarding and a more standardized sort of like economic model for the hub to know how it's going to accrue value from securing additional chains. But currently, like we're sort of far from this. Currently, we still need to. There's a lot of like governance involved, so there's a lot of politics actually involved in launching a consumer chain, and so it makes it very that plus the fact that this mismatch between the cost, the infrastructure cost, and the revenue from consumer chains makes it pretty hard to actually scale that system to like hundreds of chains within the next 2 years, for example. Like I have absolutely no doubt that technical improvements and economic model improvements will make it much more scalable over time. But currently, it seems like inappropriate to sort of think that that's going to happen in the short term. And so, to your point about whether this is like a service that we should try and get as many customers as possible for, or more of a partnership. I think in the current situation, at least, it makes much more sense for the hub to approach this as sort of a very close partnership. And not only that, but a sort of like premium one, which is like the hub is not the only chain that can become a security provider. Like replicated security can be, it's a Cosmos SDK module. So any chain could come around and add it to their binary and start providing security to other chains. Now, the Cosmos Hub is uniquely placed to actually do this because it doesn't have a product of its own sort of like handled by its binary, and that makes it pretty neutral when it comes to the consumer chain, so it doesn't compete with the chain that it secures. It has a very high market cap, a fairly established validator set, and so it's very well positioned to do that. And so my take on this is that the hub should actually be carefully vetting the projects that it launches so that it tries to maximize how successful these applications will be, and also participates in manufacturing this success by, supporting, incubating, accelerating these projects, helping them bootstrap, liquidity, user bases, and all of these things, and also guiding sort of like close integrations within the projects that launched in this atom economic zone, right? So at least for now, and for sort of like the foreseeable future, I think it will be much more of a question of like close partnerships than it will be more of like a business that we're just like funneling customers for. But that may change in the future. And I think sort of like more lightweight models of replicated security may help facilitate that transition eventually. Like, sort of like opt-in security, which is the idea that instead of lending the entire validator set, you could lend portions of the validator set, and therefore reduce the infrastructure cost to just like some of the operators, and therefore secure more chains, although with slightly different trust assumptions, might help. Mesh security and other shared security techniques might also be ways for the hub to actually have a similar relationship with other projects, but less closely bound, so that it can approach it as a bit more of a customer to business relationship than it currently should be, in my opinion, with replicated security.
Right. In a funny way, it almost sounds like the Cosmos Hub is doing what YC calls do things that don't scale in the beginning, right? Like going one to one and have these like tailored white glove relationships. And I know Neutron is trying to do some of that with the first apps that it's onboarding as well. But then the hope is that eventually we get to a point where, hey, look, here are some best practices and here are some governance mechanisms that are mature enough such that we can start to standardize, templatize, and therefore scale these mechanisms. And in fact, I'm curious to hear whether, because I know Neutron has been innovating in this regard as well with some of the opt-out mechanics, and I understand even some of the kind of a stipend kind of thinking of like what is a basic incentive, a basic almost kind of like validator basic income, so to speak, from from new partner chains. Whether these ideas are starting to become templatized or maybe even adopted by newer partner chains that are in consideration right now.
I mean, they're certainly being explored. There are trade-offs with all of them, right? I think it sort of depends on what the hub's priorities are. If the goal is to scale replicated security to as many chains as possible in the short term, then having ideas like the soft opt-out, the stipend make a lot of sense, because they allow you to alleviate the financial pressure on the node operators that secure the hub and its consumer chains, so that you can avoid two things. First, like having operators that are financially unsustainable because of the added infrastructure cost of the consumer chains, and two, avoid the centralizing force that would create on the Cosmos Hub's validator set if validators start like not breaking even anymore on their company. Although obviously that should be sort of like taken with a grain of salt, because actually validators in Cosmos do run a lot of chains at a loss for a variety of reasons, like access, MEV, exposure, publicity, sort of like community relationship and such, right? But yeah, these ideas are being explored. I think it's I think what's interesting to see is that we have both a shift at the technical implementation level. So like the soft opt-out is one of these features, right? It's a fairly basic feature, which is thought of as more of a like temporary fix to ensure that we're not creating any sort of centralizing force onto the validator set, and that operators who want, like, the way it works, by the way, for everybody, is simply an operator that is in the bottom 5% of the voting power on the Cosmos Hub is not slashed or jailed. It's not punished if it doesn't start running a node on Neutron, right? Because that's only 5% of the voting power, it doesn't compromise too much on the liveness and security of the chain. And the chain retains the entire economic security of the Cosmos Hub. But it does have a few quirks. And ideally, if replicated security as a concept is that you get the whole set, then you should be getting the whole set. And so this feature eventually should be removed and replaced by having a more sound sort of like economic system. In the case of Neutron, it's also and mostly going to be about ensuring that the platform is tremendously successful, so that it generates the amount of revenue that allows anyone to break even or make profits on the fact that they're also securing Neutron anyway. One of the other sort of like elements is stake distribution and the distribution of value throughout the Cosmos Hub set. Like many blockchains outside, like in today, the hub has a distribution that is pretty top heavy, and so for the sake of the infrastructure, for its decentralization, it would benefit from actually distributing that a bit more evenly, provided that the node operators are worth that stake. But but like first it's easy to say, but it's a bit harder to do in practice. I think there's a bunch of ways that this can be improved over time. We've already seen the ICF update its delegation policy, which is, I think, a really good step in the right direction. And I think there's a few sort of like intrinsic problems with staking that may be solved or at least partially addressed by the advent of liquid staking providers, which as entities have a lot more resource and expertise to sort of help curate how the stake is distributed, and can avoid some of those sort of like the pitfalls of just like native delegations where people are incentivized by the UI, by the fact that it's very difficult to research everything about a validator and all of these factors to make better delegations than the natural distribution that you get in delegated proof of stake on most networks. And solving that distribution of stake has an impact on replicated security and sustainability, because just like the rest of proof of stake revenue, the revenue from consumer chain is distributed to validators and delegators based on their commissions. Based on their stake, and then the validators take a commission on that. So there's a few other like ideas that are being put in place. If you have a flatter distribution, the revenue is better distributed across the operators, which have roughly the same cost, right? There's an average, and depending on how they run their infrastructure, it varies. But basically speaking, if you count, like, let's say $1,000 per operator per month, you'll cover the vast majority of operators. And so once we get that, we know that replicated security is somewhat sustainable. The second thing is, there are mechanisms like having different commission rates on the hub and the consumer chains, which would allow validators to adjust how much of the staking, the revenue they're taking to cover their expenses, and then anything beyond that would be just like given to the delegators essentially. That's another idea that could help sort of like scale replicated security without introducing sort of like subsidy-like mechanisms, which are somewhat, let's say, unpopular in the industry, and for good reasons, I guess.
Right, and even if we make it flatter, does it kind of introduce a new incentive to game the system with some sort of like Sybil attack, or not to say Sybil, but like to just break your stake across more validators, right? Yeah.
So here, what I'm talking about is not changing the curve of how the revenue is distributed. It's simply just like keeping the stake weighted distribution, which is a Sybil resistant mechanism, but just ensuring that the way stake is handled in the ecosystem is handled better from the perspective of distributing voting power in the system, so that we don't rely on a few large entities for most of the voting power and most of the ability to hold the chain, censor blocks, and such, right? So I think it's mostly about providing better interfaces for users to learn about validators and pick which ones they want to delegate with, providing better validator set management technologies and strategies through liquid staking, having large holders like foundations and core like founding entities have more reasonable, more fleshed out and fully functioning delegation policies and the likes, right? Those, I think, would be sort of like three of the great ways that you can address stake distribution without introducing sort of like Sybil risk or similar problems.
Right, because we're like in Cosmos anyway, we're very far on like the one end of the spectrum, that now we're just moving it closer to the middle, but it's not at risk of like being too open to like you said, Sybil attacks. I'm curious though whether
it's like you get revenue based on how much atom you have.
Yeah.
Now the atom you have depends on how much atoms you own as an operator, but it also depends on how much delegations you get. And so the idea here is we're not changing the way that revenue is distributed to you. We're changing how much stake you end up having because of the number of delegations that you have. The idea being, for example, we could move some of that, like Cosmos, just like Ethereum, and like that's one of the big reasons why Lido was created in the first place. Cosmos has large validators that are delegated to by centralized exchanges or custodians, right? This makes a lot of sense, and custodians and centralized exchanges are able to provide very well integrated, very high quality services. But we should be providing decentralized alternatives, trustless alternatives that essentially have feature parity or that are at least as attractive, so that we can avoid having that concentration of stake within a few entities, and instead have multiple node operators that are equally as competitive and can receive then can like receive large shares of the voting power, so that overall the set becomes more distributed.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up Lido and in the Ethereum ecosystem, because this is also a question that many other ecosystems are contending with, right? And of course, like the figuring out the economics and relationships of replicated security is something that, for example, Polkadot has tried to go through with the parachain auctions, and now with Ethereum. I guess the relationship with somewhat the rollups or restaking apps with EigenLayer is something that is yet to be live yet. So that ecosystem has to figure it out. I wonder whether here are any comparisons you like to make, or whether in the form of like learnings that we might have taken from other ecosystems, or we could take, or vice versa, where like here are some lessons where you think like that other ecosystems trying a similar things could take from.
Wow, that's a tough question, actually. Um, yeah, I mean, I think there's a bunch, right? The first thing is that we see today that launching on replicated security is a highly political process that heavily involves governance. I think as the system matures, a lot of the sort of like auxiliary considerations that go into the process today should be made entirely trustless and automated. They should be handled by the code, essentially. And only sort of like the core tenants should be handled by governance, if anything is handled by governance. So like governance minimization, I think is going to be a strong and important trend. At the same time, one of the strong reasons why the process is so governance heavy currently is that negotiating, like having sort of like a one size fits all template for how these chains should interact with the hub is unlikely to work, at least currently, because you have a very wide diversity of projects and their nature, right? So like Neutron is a small contract platform. So what it does is it allows numerous applications to launch on the same like infrastructure, basically, and benefit from network effects, better cross-chain infrastructure, and the like. As such, it's likely that if any type of chain is going to have meaningful amounts of activity, Neutron should be that one. But at the same time, you also have, and so it makes sense to have a service agreement, well, a security agreement that is structured around sharing revenue, right? Because that's the interest of both of the projects. Both of the projects need to ensure that Neutron generates as much revenue as possible because it benefits both of them. So the incentives alignment is pretty close. But you also have like other types of chains that may be very valuable for the hub to launch on replicated security. E.g., we have projects like Duality and Entry Point and others that are providing a specific application. They're making up specific blockchains, and having them closely related to the hub would help sort of like have Atom as a token be sort of like become more money like by making sure that it's like the base asset in the systems. And so here you may have different systems, right? Because as one application, they don't necessarily need to generate like hundreds of thousands of transactions per day, but they will have sort of like a business model. And so figuring out a way to integrate replicated security into that business model so that a portion of the revenue can be shared, or maybe a token so that exposure to the success of that project can be shared, is something that's likely to become interesting in the future as well. And I think some of the infrastructure that is being built on Neutron today, so stuff like the Atom 2.0 allocator, which I know you guys have covered before, I think is likely to become a pretty important mechanism in this whole thing, because it will allow consumer chains and the hub to enter sort of like programmatic on-chain agreements to help, for the hub get exposure and for the project get early liquidity, and similar agreements. And so I think that has a lot of potential. Now, yeah, I guess that would be probably the main sort of like lesson from this whole thing, which is that governance minimization should be the goal, but it's very hard to do in practice, and so it's likely to be an iterative process.
Yeah, if I may draw the comparison, because we've looked quite deeply into the Polkadot parachain auctions as well, and I would say that that has worked really well in generating demand for dots, because people need to like take out all the dot and stake into these parachain slots to win these auctions and it's locked in there for then like 1 year for Kusama, 2 years for Polkadot itself, and that is a very standardized process. It's scalable, and that is the design path that Polkadot has gone down. So in this case, Cosmos, we're less scalable, it's quite governance dependent. But the real upside here is that we get the shared kind of mutual ownership, right? Like you said, it scales with the revenue potential and the upside potential of the partner chain. So because the hub itself is earning Neutron ownership, there is strong incentive alignment, right? Unlike Polkadot, where like, oh, 1 year is up. If you don't win the auction, 2 years up. If you don't win the auction, goodbye. Yeah, it's just gone, and there's less of a relationship. It feels more impersonal. Whereas in this case, it's really kind of a dedicated really partnership, right? And hence like partner chain feels so apt as named here, and so I do feel that it's a fresh take that hopefully we can see great success from. One major implication, of
I
course,
agree with
is
this.
alignment.
If I may, like this boils down to the points that we were discussing just before, right? So that you have this tension between an investment relationship, where
Yeah.
you want to have very close relationship, where you're going to try your best to make that project successful because you both share into sort of like the outcome of that relationship, or a service level, like a service agreement sort of relationship. Polkadot is more on that side of the spectrum, whereby as long as you're paying the well, participating in the auction and winning the slot, you get the slot. Once you don't, bye bye. So it's interesting that we actually get this sort of like um, precedent to build around of. Like I do think that
Yeah.
standardizing this mechanism makes well, I mean, streamlining it definitely makes a lot of sense. Bringing as much as possible on chain makes a lot of sense, but exactly how to structure the agreements initially is probably something that will take a lot more time and iteration before it's even possible to consider it and make
Mm.
it very viable, in my opinion.
Right, and who knows, right? Like maybe we don't even go down governance minimize. We go some sort of sub-DAO model of like, hey, here are a few types of partners that we want, and we have like committees and like a referendum on like who should be the partner committee members to then curate the partner chains for those priorities. That might be an option. But the thought I wanted to go down just now, which is this kind of like almost tailor-made relationships has made possible a new concept, which is the Atom economic zone. Right? It's not just like, hey, let's just generate a demand for Atom, but here's where, hey, look, these are like other products that are complementary and can drive value of Atom by giving the validators more rewards or giving Atom itself more utility, kind of extending the functionality of the hub. And I love for you to define Atom economic zone. If I may just throw an analogy out there, one funny kind of ironic bit is that the hub itself is meant to be a minimal hub, right, where you don't want to have any functionality, and so you're pushing it all to the partner chains. But at the same time, what Atom economic zone is hub maximalism, where I want everybody to like be part of the hub and use Atom and like kind of like become the base asset of this whole ecosystem. And so it's both minimalism and maximalism at the same time. Somehow that works. But yes, what's your take? What is AEZ?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think your take makes a lot of sense. I would describe the Atom economic zone as the set of chains that are closely connected together and with the Cosmos Hub, and therefore create something you can like the analogy that I would use is something of the tune of like the European Union or a federation. Essentially, you have sort of like this entity that everybody participates in, and then you have like sort of like um, at least partially sovereign entities that compose all of it, and they're all part of the same larger body, and their interests are aligned in that regard, and so they work together to be successful together, essentially. I think your example makes a lot of sense in the sense that it's technical minimalism, e.g., the hub doesn't need to have much more than governance, staking, and replicated security to be able to perform sort of like this vision of the Atom economic zone. And then it's political maximalism, essentially, whereby we're going to recreate this sort of like federation around the hub, where we're going to help make Atom more money-like, more like a reserve asset to be used in the ecosystem. We're going to deploy it so that this section of Cosmos as a whole has very deep integrations, very deep liquidity, is able to collaborate together very efficiently. And we're starting to see some of this, right? So you have projects like Stride, for example, which is a liquid staking protocol Stride is in the process of migrating, in their case, since they already have a live blockchain, they're in the process of migrating to replicated security. And as part of their proposal to the hub to do so, they included a section about receiving 450,000 atoms and then liquid staking half of that with their service, and then pairing it with the remaining atom into a liquidity pool on Neutron, right, onto Astroport on Neutron. So here you have like 3 blockchains collaborating to get an end result, right? You have the Cosmos Hub that's providing liquidity. You have Stride that's helping liquid stake that, therefore participating in securing the blockchain, but also providing yield on the position of the community pool of the hub. And you have Neutron sort of like providing a venue, a DeFi environment in which that liquidity can be deployed and used to build further applications, further use cases on. I think these sort of initiatives are likely to become more frequent as sort of like the atom economic zone evolves. There's a bunch of research that's being done, like brainstorming, I would say, with other projects like Entry Point, Noble, and others about like how we can connect these services very closely to generate sort of like not only, for example, the DeFi ecosystem on Neutron, but sort of like this meta DeFi ecosystem of the atom economic zone, basically. So I think that's one layer where it's very interesting as a concept. The second layer is sort of like the social capital, social consensus layer, where you have additional sort of like initiatives, like, for example, Neutron will have most likely a grants program is sort of like handled on chain, and the Cosmos Hub already has a committee that is in charge, that is like of making grants on behalf of the Cosmos Hub. Right now, these two can collaborate to fund projects that are eligible, like that makes sense to bring to the economic zone, and that will add value to both the hub and Neutron. There's even further ways to that we can take this partnership, and like perhaps you want to touch upon this, or should we keep this as a
No. I think we can. So I know what you're alluding to. Basically, at the time of recording, we've already had a soft announcement of the AEZ Accelerator that you shared during the Gateway event, right? And in fact, at this time as well, the proposal is up, and it already has gone through AA and is going through the Neutron governance process right now to fund such an initiative, which is, of course, in partnership with LongHashX, which we're very excited to be part of.
Yeah, for sure. I just had a quick look, and we have 96% of yes votes, so that's looking pretty good. But yeah, so all of the social capital of that exists within the atom economic zone can also collaborate on bringing sort of like these initiatives that sort of like to go back to what we were saying very early on in this episode, is that we have great tech, we need to bring it to market, and these sort of initiatives are a great way to do this, and they're value additive to not only one chain but the entire sub ecosystem of the atom economic zone.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it feels like a much more cohesive ecosystem because there's already this, like you said, a clear social consensus that we're all contributing to this shared economic zone, and actual economic alignment in the different setup, be it liquid staking, and then like how we can deploy that on the smart contracts on Neutron and so on. Which I want to touch on a debate, which I know you've been following a little bit in the Ethereum ecosystem, about whether rollups are sovereign or not. And in Cosmos and replicated security is especially interesting because there is no enshrined bridge, right? From Atom to Neutron itself. So I mean, we have IBC, I'm sure, but then it's different in the way that the Ethereum rollups are set up. And there's also the question of I guess new chains coming on. For example, Stride themselves, they were a sovereign app chain before they got onboarded as a partner chain, and Neutron itself will have many native assets that's issuing, or like new chains like Noble will have native assets which they want to retain a very strong control over. So, to what extent are partner chains sovereign? Do you view Neutron as sovereign, or how would you call it? How would you categorize that?
Yeah, so to go back to the analogy of like a federation, well, in this case, more like, for example, like take the European Union, right? Like France is part of the European Union, yet it is sovereign. If it wanted to break away from the treaties and do something, it would be completely able to. Now it doesn't, because it pledged that it wouldn't, but also because there is a mutual beneficial reasons why you wouldn't want to do that. You would continue to keep those relationship with all of these other countries and have like these close or like alignment mechanisms and shared like services, functions, and the like, right? I see replicated security as somewhat similar to this. Like consumer chains, well, I mean, both sides can terminate the agreement at a moment's notice, essentially. Like the validators of the Cosmos Hub, just like any other Cosmos chains, actually. But if 34% of the validator set of the voting power decided not to run Neutron anymore, the chain would halt. Like it would not be secured anymore. It would not even function anymore. So that's one way that it could be done. The hub could make a proposal to kick Neutron off of replicated security. Neutron could make a proposal to do what Stride is doing, but the other way around, to leave replicated security. All of these things are possible. In my opinion, what maintains this this relationship is the fact that it is more mutually beneficial to be part of that relationship than to get out of it, right? And so you get back to sort of like the same elements as we have in our roll-up bridge, like is the bridge equal the roll-up sort of discussion that we've had recently, whereby at the end of the day, what really decides whether the chain or the roll-up is sovereign, but whether or not it exercises that sovereignty is whether or not it's beneficial to do so, right? There's a cost to exercising it. If a consumer chain wants to leave, there's technical cost, coordination cost. We need to find new validator set, recreate a bunch of IBC channels. You may lose, a large part of the sort of like the liquidity, the asset, the value on the chain. If it is from the Cosmos Hub, you may have like there's a whole bunch of hurdles, right, of cost to actually exercising this. And so the question is like, is there more benefits to being in that relationship or to leaving it? As long as the relationship is mutually beneficial, I think replicated security has absolutely no reason to sort of like fall apart, essentially. But I think that, like, and what I like about this is that it sets the objective and sort of like the direction clearly, right? There's like with the whole hub as no value accrual mechanism, sort of like refrain that we've heard for years now. I think there's a strong pressure right now to sort of like recoup some of this frustration by extracting value as much as possible. I completely understand that feeling, but I think it's a bit short-sighted because like what keeps consumer chains coming to replicated security in the atomic economic zone and what will maintain them there is actually the hub's ability to generate new value with them, essentially, like generate additional value rather than systematically try to capture it, right? Like accruing value to the hub is obviously a part of it, right? I'm not saying that it shouldn't and that it should provide its services for free. I'm just saying that the focus, especially at such an early time and at a time where Cosmos is trying to really cement its place in the industry as a whole, and bring technologies that it has spent years and hundreds of millions of dollars developing into the industry. Like I think the main priority should be like, how do we make these systems and these protocols like as successful as possible, share the value that we are creating together, and yeah, rather than just
yeah. It's not like a colonial power trying to get all these entrenched interests embedded in these other chains. Rather,
it could try to do that, but I'm not sure how how successful it could be.
That's
like
right.
Currently, there's only one colony to try and exploit, so I'm not sure that would be so profitable either.
Yeah, and you scare away the rest as well. So it's actually
Exactly.
more like an economic zone where, like you said, it's from mutual benefit. It's a voluntary partnership, and in fact, even more important in the Cosmos ecosystem, where sovereignty is a core value, right? And that's why the whole app chain thesis is kind of built upon that. Hey, have your own chain, have your own thing, but now we can voluntarily enter into these partnerships whenever it makes sense, and mutually kind of like join this economic zone to collaboratively build out value with ADAM-based assets.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think what's one trend that I see in Cosmos that I think is very interesting is that we're seeing layers after layers of possible partnerships between these chains sort of like coming online, right? Like one traditional one, like mechanism for aligning interest has been to sort of like come together to provide liquidity for the native assets of the various chains, right? That's all like still going to be the case. It is becoming easier to do. primitives like the covenant system, for example, will make it easier for chains to come together and decide that, hey, let's provide liquidity together. But it will also make like much more involved sort of types of agreements between these chains, like financial diplomacy in a way. Sort of like, for example, let's do a token swap and let's have some restrictions on when the tokens will be sold, and let's stake some of them, or let's use them as collateral in mesh security so that we secure each other. And you can layer these bricks essentially of relationship together to create like very custom sort of like relationships within the different points on the IBC network, basically. And I think that's going to be an interesting sort of like trend to watch.
Absolutely. And I know we spent like 45 minutes, a bit more theoretical, going through all of replicated security and Cosmos. I now let's go into Neutron itself, right? Because I know we've been talking about these ideas, but they're real. They're here. Neutron is live, and this has been an incredible journey. Well, Prop 72, which I think many regard as the beginnings of replicated security, was 1 year ago, and Prop 792 was few months ago, and now we're here at Genesis. We've gone through also the launch sequence where we had an auction, a liquidity lock drop, airdrops. So now Neutron has been distributed, and like we have formed a community, we have security, and we have more apps coming up. So I know we're going to talk about the future of Neutron a bit, but I just wanted to also like linger on this history of how we got here, because this has been a rich case example. So from all these proposals and this entire process, 72, 792, Genesis, and I know with all these validators working it out, and then like the whole community launch sequence, how do you feel about this whole journey? What were some of the highlights, the hardest things, and the biggest lessons that you've taken away from it?
Well, that's a really good question, to be honest. I think the first thing is that it's been a year and some now, but it doesn't feel like it. It feels like 3 months ago was Prop 72. So like things have been fast, at least from our perspective, I guess.
Oh, maybe we should summarize Prop 72 real quick. Yeah.
Yeah. So you know what? I'll give you a brief history of like Neutron.
Yeah.
So Neutron started as an idea when we were working on cross-chain applications in Cosmos, like cross-chain DeFi applications, and we wanted to build them as smart contracts because smart contracts have some trade-offs that may be very interesting. Like like not everything needs to be an app chain, actually. Although we do believe in the app chain thesis, and we can talk about this later. But smart contracts are great for a few things, including the fact that it's much easier to iterate on them. It's much quicker. You don't have as many dependencies when doing so. And that's something that you can really leverage for sort of like designing the product and reaching product market fit faster, basically. But anyway, like, so we were working on building these cross-chain DeFi applications, and one of the things that was really troublesome is that while doing IBC transfers, like just sending a token from one chain to the other, was manageable with contracts, all of the more advanced cross-chain infrastructure that really makes Cosmos interesting was sort of designed with app chains in mind, and therefore not really either convenient or available to small contracts. And so that led us to identify sort of like 3 main friction points to building successful cross-chain DeFi applications in Cosmos. First one was the lack of security of the small contracting platforms that were available. $150 million of staked asset is, it's nice, but if you're going to be looking to build a tremendously successful DeFi application, you're probably going to have more TVL than this eventually, or at least you should aim for that to happen. So security was the first one. The second one was, as I said, like the lack of cross-chain infrastructure for small contracts, and 3 was sort of like the lack of of a credibly neutral place where to deploy that application, so that you would be able, your application, when it expands to other chains, is able to sort of not trigger the tribal reactions of, oh, this application is not from our chain, so we don't want to use it. So that providing this neutral ground so that applications could actually exist across multiple chains without being associated with like one specifically, and therefore like triggering immune reactions to them. And so we were researching ways that we could solve these problems when Prop 72, the initial version of it, was posted on the forum. And we discovered this kind of like by at random, right? We saw a proposal, Prop 72, that was saying replicated security is coming to the hub. We're looking for partners to build some of the first chains to launch on replicated security, and start give them some funding from the hub, build support for these apps, and therefore have them sort of pioneer the go-to-market of replicated security. And so at the time where that proposal came up, we were researching these problems, and replicated security was already something that we had on our mind. And the reason for that was that it allowed us to solve two of the three problems, which is the degree of security and the sort of providing central, critically neutral place in the ecosystem where you could launch your applications by aligning with the hub essentially. And it allowed us to essentially focus on solving the last problem, which is the crushed infrastructure for smart contracts. And so that sort of solidified the ideas that we already had, and we decided to propose a DeFi hub to be built as one of these first consumer chains, DeFi hub, which later came to be known as Neutron. Now, fast forward multiple audits, half a dozen or more testnets, we made the final proposal to the Cosmos Hub, Prop 792. That proposal was accepted by the Cosmos Hub community with 90+% votes in favor, and therefore that led to the spawn time being reached, at which point Neutron started launching essentially. Now there were a few technical hiccups because some problems were identified, notably with the ability of validators to assign keys on the Cosmos Hub prior to the launch. That's a technicality, so I don't think we need to get too deep into it. But essentially, what that meant is that validators were some portion of the voting power was not available to start to launch Neutron when it should have been because of a technical issue. And so to fix this and be able to launch anyway, some validators had to run with the same key as they use on the provider chain, which is, from a software perspective, completely fine. But from an operational perspective, as a validator, you don't really want to be moving your keys around. And so it's sort of not very natural to have to do so. But fortunately, some of the node operators were very supportive, and they helped bring us to the point where we could start finalizing blocks, at which point we were able to unwind the technical problem and finally get a chain that's stable, secure, in sync with the Cosmos Hub, which is Neutron now.
Which part do you find the most challenging? Because there were so many facets here, right? Actually coming up with the idea and building out a product, getting it audited and tested, so the product and infra itself, the politics with the hub, and getting the voters in line, the validators, and making sure that their incentives were right, and making sure they're bought in and they will come and actually secure the chain, and also the users, right, with the airdrop, with the liquidity lock drop, and so on, and now leading the apps. How do you feel about all of these? Which ones spoke to you the most?
I think for the three things that I think we found most challenging were establishing the right relationship with the Cosmos Hub, its validator, and its users, because it's very intrinsically political, right? And people say democracy is dissensus with a mechanism to resolve it. I do think that even though delegated proof of stake is not democracy per se, but I do think that the same applies here, whereby we received a tremendous amount of support throughout the process from the Cosmos Hub community, and that has been absolutely instrumental to making Neutron what it is today. At the same time, obviously, there were debates around the economic model, the sustainability of validators and stuff. And while we've tried to do our best to sort of get in front of these problems, transparently, from the get-go, as soon as we ourselves identified some potential issues in the future, obviously that led to a lot of conversations, and some of them are not fully resolved yet, which is why we discussed for such a long time on the economic model of replicated security, right? There's still work to be done there, and there's still work to be done to make Neutron tremendously successful so that it actually provides meaningful amount of revenue to the hub as well. So I think that has been the most challenging part of the entire process, and it was compounded by the fact that it's the first project to ever do that, and so there's no real template or processes for how these things should be handled. But still, as I said, we got tremendous support from the Cosmos community in general, and so it made the whole thing very worth it.
Absolutely. Wow. And what a journey. So in the end, it comes back to the people, like you said, and even though it's supportive, Yes, social consensus in the end. Which there is one question I forgot to ask just now when we were talking about like sovereignty, and now since we're talking about people, it came back to me around the power dynamics as well, and in particular with slashing specifically, because I know this was a major issue with one of the partner chains that pulled out, right? As I understand, Noble had a lot of problems with it, and in this case, like who has the power to then like determine the future? Like you said, dissension, right? And what are consequences for dissenting? If you say, hey, this validator is not doing its job, right? Do we have the power to then unilaterally jail and slash, or do we have to kind of go through the hub itself to make that decision? And therefore, the hub actually is self-governing in a way, because they can then like reject the slashing or jailing conditions.
So in the initial version of replicated security, the way it worked is essentially both chains actually have a consensus engine, right? So both Neutron and the Cosmos Hub are running their own versions of Tendermint. The only difference on the Neutron side is that instead of calculating who the validators are and how much voting power they have, it gets that as a message over IBC from the Cosmos Hub, right? The Cosmos Hub tells it what the validators are. Now, because it actually has a consensus engine, it's able to verify that validators are working as they should, and it's able to identify when they're equivocating, like double signing or not being up, and all of the sort of like traditional misbehaviors that protocols usually handle from validators. As a result of this, it's able to create proofs that the validators should be slashed. Now, because the stake is not on Neutron itself, it can't directly slash them on Neutron. The stake is on the hub. So what Neutron does is it sends the message with the proof to the Cosmos hub. In the first version of replicated security, that message would then be triggered instantly by the Cosmos hub and slash the deposit on the Cosmos hub. That's an important mechanism because it's one of the guarantees that uphold the entire like proof of stake system, right? Now, currently, because of sort of like the experimental nature of this technology early on, there was a strong worry that you could have a consumer chain that had, let's say, a technical problem or that is malicious and that uses this mechanism to slash a large amount of the voting power on the Cosmos hub, therefore destroying value, but also sort of like redistributing power in the system with like depending on where the remaining stake would be. And so basically there are two things that changed. The first one is well, there's just one thing that changed. The first one is that slashing is still possible today, except instead of being triggered automatically, before a validator is slashed, there's a confirmation proposal on the Cosmos hub whereby the social consensus basically looks at the proof, recognizes that yes, this validator misbehaved, and then slash them, or don't if the consumer chain is being malicious. And once again, you have some political game theory here whereby technically the hub community could decide not to slash validators that misbehaved, but in the long term, that's likely to be a losing losing outcome because it undermines the confidence that other consumer chains have in launching on the hub, basically. So that's sort of like the current circumstances. So currently, jailing is still possible and automatically. E.g., if you're supposed to be validating Neutron and you go down for 4 days, Neutron will jail you on the Cosmos hub. So even if you're validating there, you're not going to get rewards until you start your node on Neutron and on the Cosmos hub and start like basically operating as normal again, at which point you can then make a transition, like a transaction to unjail yourself and start earning rewards again. So that mechanism is in place and working currently. Slashing is limited by governance. It's governance gated currently. And Informal Systems and the team who developed the replicated security code are working on what they call the untrusted protocol, the untrusted consumer chain protocol, which is, because of the worry that we discussed previously, right, where a malicious consumer chain could wrongfully slash on the Cosmos hub. Instead, the system would now take the proof that is generated by the consumer chain and then verify that proof in order to ascertain that, yes, indeed, that validator should be slashed, so that we don't rely on governance anymore and we can do slashing, but we have certainty that the Cosmos hub is not going to be at risk of wrongful slashing, essentially.
There are a couple of things that I really want to touch on for Neutron's differentiator right? So one is the tech that you talked about, which is all the cross-chain infrastructure that we're able to offer with like IBC, ICA, ICQ, and also I know that Neutron has some very interesting governance modular mechanisms that can be implemented and interact with the ecosystem apps in very interesting ways. So why don't we start with the first one? And maybe we start with introducing some of these terms first for those who are less familiar, and then like what are some examples of people using it, either theoretical or like real coming up very soon.
Yeah, sounds good. So, um, I mean, we can simplify them into two categories. Like the first one is giving smart contract applications the ability to do things on other blockchains, and the second one is giving smart contract applications the ability to know things about what's going on outside of the blockchain, right? So for the first one, we call it the interchain transactions module. It's also known as the interchain accounts module in its sort of like vanilla version that's already in production. No more like a Cosmos chains currently. What it does is essentially it allows smart contracts to send transactions, well, to register accounts on other blockchains that have this module, send transactions to them, execute them, but also receive status updates on whether these transactions were successful, whether they timed out or they failed, and then to do callbacks, e.g., to react to the status of these transactions. And so with this setup, what you can do is you can have sequences of actions that form kind of like an algorithm of actions rather than just fire and forget sort of things, and that allows you to do pretty complex operations across multiple chains. Like one, well, I'll introduce the second part first, and then we'll get into sort of like the possible applications of this. The second part is what we call interchain queries. There's a few implementations of interchain queries that are either live or coming live into the ecosystem currently. There's roughly two ways that you can do them in general. There's the Cosmos SDK one, which requires module which has different trade-offs, and then there's the key value store query, which we've implemented. What our implementation allows you to do is it allows your smart contract to register a new query permissionlessly, and that query will essentially be passed on to a relayer, which will go and look into the blockchain's storage for the specific data that you wanted, plus the numerical proofs that prove the validity of that data, basically. The relayer takes that data plus the proofs, brings it back to Neutron, and then two things need to happen for that data to be useful to your business application. The first one is, the data needs to be verified, e.g., we need to make sure that the relayer didn't change some of these values. And so we use, the Cosmos SDK module, the interesting queries module on Neutron, to check the validity of these numerical proofs, since we know the state of the other blockchains through the ABC Lite client, whatever. And then the second part is once we know that the data is authentic, we need to process it into a data structure that is actually useful for the business side smart contract applications. That's one of the perhaps most significant differences between Neutron's implementation and others lies, which is that other implementations have both of these functions handled at the Cosmos SDK level, which, to upgrade, you need to hold the chain, slap a new binary, and then relaunch the chain. Neutron did things a little bit differently. We moved that function to the smart contract layer, which allows us to update these contracts like much more easily, essentially, and to allow people to essentially register query permissionlessly, right? So anyone can spin up a contract for that interesting query, and they can update that contract so that they can adapt to changing situations on the other side, on the queried chain, and they can evolve the queries that they're using with the product that they're using. And this is somewhat fundamental because other implementations of interesting queries currently are sort of designed with one application in mind, right? So for example, Quicksilver and Stride have interesting queries in production today, as far as I know. But they have a very limited number of queries that you can do because they don't need other queries. They just need the ones that are useful to the liquid staking protocol that they're running, right? Now, on Neutron, it's a bit of a different matter because what we're trying to build here is an ecosystem of very different applications. And so ensuring that we have a mechanism that allows developers to essentially register queries for the data that they need is absolutely crucial. And so our implementation does that. Now, when you combine these two things together, you can build applications that are pretty interesting because they can exist across multiple chains, but feel like they're just on one application. You can abstract away basically the complexity of the cross-chain nature of these applications, and that has benefits for application builders that we can get into later. But sort of like to give an example of how this could work. You could imagine a liquid staking protocol that is able to provide liquid staking for upwards of for up to 51 blockchains in IBC currently, simply by deploying one set of smart contract on one blockchain. So there's no need to redeploy everywhere, which wouldn't scale, but also wouldn't be possible because not every chain in Cosmos has smart contract capabilities. Now, instead of trying to do that, you can simply make one set of smart contract that leverages Neutron's infrastructure to provide liquid staking to all of these chains. The way it works is, you have a user that has an account on, let's say, pick a chain for me. Where's the user?
Osmosis, which is a
well, I mean that's a particular choice.
It's actually
not very liquid staking. Let's use osmosis anyway.
Okay.
Not financial advice, not saying that this will happen, but let's use it as an example. So I'm on Osmosis and I have Osmo tokens. I want to liquid stake them through liquid staking protocol X. That protocol is deployed on Neutron, but it has a interchain account registered on Osmosis. Now, traditionally, what I would have to do is I need to bridge to the chain where the protocol is, and then provide my assets there, and then the protocol will handle them. Now, with interchain queries and interchain accounts, what we can do is simply I log into the same web interface as I would for any chain that the protocol supports, and when I use my transaction to liquid stake, the protocol knows which chain I'm currently on. And instead of building a transaction that would IBC to the first chain, then provide, I simply send the tokens from my account on Osmosis to the protocol's account on Osmosis. Now the protocol has control over these assets, right? They can be verified by using an interchain query. We can check that indeed we have received these tokens. And then the protocol knows that, okay, I've received the deposit. I can now mint the derivative. And so it mints the derivative on Neutron, sends it over IBC to the user's wallet directly. The user doesn't know about any of this. It just waits, and then the tokens are in this wallet. Now, the protocol controls where the assets are, right? So it can proceed with delegating these assets. The business contracts on Neutron can have specific logic to how these staking should be handled, right? Which validator should be delegated to, in which proportions, and what have you. Using interchain queries, it can retrieve all of the data that it needs, all of the on-chain data that it needs to be able to perform these strategies, like these validator set management strategies. And then essentially, once it has this information, made some compute to understand how much of my Osmo token should be delegated to each validator. It can simply issue a transaction over IBC. That transaction is sent to Osmosis and executed, which means that these tokens are now delegated. So the user has the beauty of this infrastructure. It may seem a bit complex on the technical side, but the beauty of this whole setup is that it allows you to abstract away the entire cross-chain complexity from the user's experience. From the user's perspective, what I did is I logged into a website, I signed a transaction, I received my tokens, which is exactly what it should be like, right? But what it hasn't been like in Cosmos so far because of all of the sort of intermediate steps that cross-chain nature of this ecosystem introduces. So yeah, that's roughly how it can work.
Awesome. And are there some real examples that you'd like to highlight? Because I know there are quite a few apps that are already either deployed or promised to deploy, and perhaps they already have some ideas about how to use these features. I think specifically, we know Astroport is already on there with an outpost. We know Catalyst had an announcement, and plenty of other DeFi protocols from Oracle's, Dexes, and so on.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, Lido is likely to build something that's very similar to what I just described. Astroport has this model so Astroport is a DEX, right? It's an AMM currently, but it is rolling out various types of pool currently. It has already expanded to Terra. Well, I mean, it launched on Terra, but it expanded to Injective and probably soon Say. And Astroport has this whole trustless cross-chain governance system, right? So that's the first thing. Now, Astroport could basically bring this to Neutron, and which would help sort of like expand it, make it more complete, more easy to manage from the perspective of what needs to be built. Because instead of having to rebuild the entire thing from Terra, which doesn't provide this infrastructure, you could essentially leverage a lot of the infrastructure that comes like hand in hand with Neutron to build sort of like these functions over time. Now, Astroport also has a very the Astroport community and the Astroport like contributors have had this very interesting sort of like thesis of the SLAM, the shared liquidity AMM, which is a take on how dexes, like multi-chain dexes, like SushiSwap, Curve, Astroport, can extract additional benefits, generate additional value by, instead of having just like isolated deployments on every chain, actually coordinating the liquidity layer so that they can best serve the traders, whilst also maximizing the utilization ratio of that liquidity and therefore the fees for the liquidity provider. That sort of implementation requires being able to move assets around between the deployments in order to be able to make sure that they're allocating that liquidity efficiently. It requires knowing about various variables in the other ecosystems that you're on. And so one naive way to build it would be you just handle the whole thing off chain, but then what's the point of building in this industry anyway? And so instead, what you can do is, well, basically you have two choices. Either you build it on another chain currently, in which case you will have to rebuild all of the infrastructure that you will need to do these actions, or you just build it on Neutron, which essentially provides like most of the basic infrastructure, like all of the basic infrastructure that you'll need to build this sort of things. Another example that's, I think, pretty interesting, well, two more examples, one of which I've sort of teased at Gateway. I guess the allocator is a very interesting one for this, right? So the allocator allows you to have community pools and DAOs on various different blockchains that come together and make a trustless agreement together through smart contracts. And so they need to be able to sort of like transfer tokens around, have programmatic agreements. Like, let's say, for example, Neutron and Osmosis want to get together and buy Bad Kids on Stargaze, right? Well, that's something that we can do. We just like send tokens together in a pool. Maybe we perform some other actions in the meantime, e.g. we could have them rebalanced so that a portion of them is used to continuously swap into stars, so that we build up a treasury of stars that we can then use to sweep on Stargaze. And all of this can be handled programmatically, right? So the like Neutron's infrastructure in this case is used to provide a primitive that will be useful for not just Neutron's ecosystem and DeFi ecosystem, but for the entire Cosmos ecosystem. It allows to like app chains to basically come together more. Another example of this would be like Gitcoin, right? Bringing Gitcoin to Neutron would mean that we have now this on-chain mechanism to run quadratic funding runs, which could be, like the matching pools for these rounds could be provided by multiple chains and projects across the ecosystem. And these projects could, register and run their own programs and their own matching rounds according to their own terms. They can even spin up their own UIs for it, so that they have their, their own branding and identity and segregated sort of like UIs for these if they want to, or they can just use the infrastructure, the smart contracts, and the UIs that we will like provide for this. And so that's another sort of like example of this, right? So Neutron's cross-chain infrastructure basically gives you two things. First, it allows you to build primitives that then become available to the entire ecosystem, which is beneficial for both, because it means that the primitive is actually getting a lot more demand, and it's also beneficial to the ecosystem because it means that they don't have to rebuild continuously the same system, and it becomes much easier to bring sort of like large projects from other ecosystems, like on Ethereum, right? Because if you're just one Cosmos chain today and you're trying to pitch like one of the major on Ethereum, and you tell them, hey, deploy on my chain, and then the next chain is going to come to them and say the same thing, and there's 51 blockchains to do the same, it's unlikely that they'll actually take the pitch. But if you can come to them and say, hey, look, deploy once on this chain and you'll get exposure to the entire Cosmos ecosystem, now that's a much more attractive sort of like value proposition and endeavor, right? So like pooling our forces and interest together through Neutron allows us to move mountains, basically. So that's point number one. Point number two, and then I'll be done, is it also allows you to make your app much more viable, much more successful. It provides you with a much better path to product market fit, because like up to Neutron's launch, when you were launching an application as a smart contract on Cosmos, you were much like what you're doing when choosing a rollup on the Ethereum ecosystem. You're choosing a winner, right? You're betting that this ecosystem is going to be where most of the value, activity, and users are going to be, and that's where you want to launch your application. If you don't want to do that, you either have to re-implement all of the cross-chain infrastructure that you'll need to scale, or you need to redeploy multiple versions of your contracts on each smart contract platform. Both of these are pretty bad solution because they don't scale very well, and they imply a lot of overhead. Now, what Neutron does is that it actually allows you to not have to choose, but rather take a bet on the entire ecosystem, right? So not just other smart contract platforms, but also the app chains, since it can connect to all of them, basically. So you can deploy your application once and then leverage the market of Cosmos as an aggregate, rather than just the local market that exists on Neutron, Juno, Say, or whatever other smart contract platform you may be considering.
Right. Wow, that's a lot to digest. And there's one thing that I know we talked a little bit about, right? Which is it's quite hard to kind of summarize all of that, all of Neutron in that one sentence. And I mean, we can kind of keep it a little high level of like, oh yeah, your gateway to the whole Cosmos ecosystem with all this cross-chain infrastructure. But it doesn't kind of explain all that complexity. So I hope we can point developers to this episode. But is there a one-liner that you have in mind, and maybe even a mascot or some sort of imagery that can help people imagine this? How would you summarize that?
So in terms of a one-liner, I'd go for something like Neutron is the most secure cross-chain smart contracting platform. I think it encapsulates sort of like the various aspects of Neutron. It's highly secure thanks to replicated security, and it's a cross-chain smart contracting platform, as opposed to just a smart contracting platform, in that a lot of the work that went into Neutron was to develop that infrastructure that is designed to essentially make your life as a developer easier, because you don't have to redevelop it. Essentially, it comes like key in hand. So I would go for this. Now, in terms of the mascot, that's actually something that I've been thinking about a lot. There have been very interesting suggestions, but I don't think we're at a point yet where we're ready to call the mascot.
Okay.
But yeah.
All right, we look forward to that. I know we are almost at the hour where you have to run, but if I may wrap up with one question. So we are just at the genesis of Neutron right now. Oh, well, we're launched, right? So post Genesis, but just the early infancy, and we're also at a critical time for Cosmos and the atom economic zone. Now, I'm sure a lot is going to happen in the next year or 3-5 years. How would you want to look back on this period of intense activity? Right? What would you like to remember this period as?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think I would like to look at this, so like the period for the next coming months, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I think I would want to look back at it and be able to be proud that we actually set up the foundations for a very successful ecosystem. And by that I mean both creating the systems, but also the organization, right? Like sharing, spreading a culture and a shared vision of what is possible to do today in Cosmos, and actually making it happen, right? Because me and my team are fairly irrelevant. Like, it doesn't matter who we are. If a bus hits me tomorrow, the chain should continue to work, and that should be the goal, right? The chain should not need me for anything. In fact, it doesn't already, which is a pretty good sign. But the ecosystem as a whole should be able to continue on its trajectory, right? And so I think a lot of what we tend to overlook is sort of like the people behind the tech. And the tech is literally just a consensus engine. It's like, how do we put people together into the same direction? And I think we need to do a lot more work on this in Neutron's case, but also in Cosmos in general, of like, sharing a mutual vision and culture for where we're trying to do, and then constructively move towards that vision. So that's going to be a lot of the work that I'm going to be doing in the next few months.
And final words to builders in Cosmos, or people who are hanging on here in the bear market.
Well, things don't happen in a day, but it's slowly and then suddenly. So we invite you to come build with us. We're pretty excited.
Perfect. And with that, that's a wrap. Thank you so much again, Spaydh. I think this is such an insightful episode and a great continuation of our Cosmos series. It's great to have you here, and we're really excited to be working together.
It's a pleasure. Anytime. Thanks for having me.
All right. And to everyone tuning in, thank you and see you next time.